Something that gets lost on people very regular when it comes to fairy tale is Mishima. I give Mishima like it as both a like it's a double edged sword. He doesn't want to just directly explain things to the reader a lot of the time because he expects people to pay attention. I think the fact that he lays Easter eggs to all his other stories and stuff is one of those things where he rewards people for having more attention to what's going on in the verse rather than just reading whatever's in the box. You know, it wants you to be able to pay attention to stuff, look for details, and as well as be able to piece things together if you know exactly what you're looking for and exactly where to look for. So, one of the things that has always been, I think, just brushed under the rug and forgotten about since the earlier days of the series is the whole flame of emotion that goes into Natsu's character. So, we know that just based off of his emotional state, you know, how angry he's getting and whatnot, how much of a rage is dwelling within him, it will increase and directly affect his temperature of his fire. And we know that it has dramatically climbed to the point where now, you know, Natsu's base skin temperature, you just hit him with a type of metal weapon and it's going to melt on contact. Whereas in the early portions of the story, we still saw displays of his heat. You know, for instance, when Gajil and him fought, he had all those metal shards just completely sticking out of his body. And he just melted them through and like had all the molten iron oozing out of his wounds. So when you look at that, it's like, okay, he's always really been at that temperature to melt metal and steel. But really, like when it comes to Natsu's more extreme moments, there's always like a level of extra steps you need to really put into to understand like what he did. Because it's easier to use. You know, you usually look at someone like Naruto or Ichigo whenever it's like Naruto has some form of clone based power up, like his, you know, oh, how are we going to show that you know, he's way more serious or he's putting more effort, more clones. And then we like Getsuga Tenshos for each to make him bigger, make him larger scale. I think the fact with science going into some of the powers with Fairy Tail, but it's not all the time, makes it a little bit harder too. Like it's what Natsu just when he beat Erigor, it was explained using, you know, the heat science and how wind and like air pressure are affected whenever you do certain things, and it makes it just again it's something a little bit more complicated. But I think at the same time, if you know what you're looking for, it makes it easier to fully grasp rather than just like, well, does 100 clones mean exactly 5 times the strength of when Naruto did 20 clones, or it's like, is he just putting in more energy? Is he, you know, is he just putting in more chakra specifically to this? Is it really a power based technique? You know, it just comes down to, okay, there's stuff that now you have to figure out how you can argue and make sense of. Whereas like with Natsu, it's just pretty direct because heat just translates into energy. Like temperature is energy. So we know that when he fought Erigor, he got mad enough that the wind around Erigor's body started to flow to Natsu and then go up. And to create a low pressure area like that with heat over such a small condensed zone, at least from what I got, I just put it into Grok. I just gave it the scenario and kind of talked about it. And this is actually something that's consistent. What I've heard for years is I'd have to look and see what experiment was conducted to do this, but having a, you know, low pressure area of high heat like that in a, you know, a localized specific spot is going to result at 5 to 10,000 degrees Celsius, just because of the fact that while it's doing this, it is forcefully altering, you know, the flow of wind and air in the atmosphere and drawing everything to this one hyper point. And it's pretty consistent when you think about, again, the levels of like where Natsu's heat was. If he already was relatively able to melt steel and iron without too much effort, even at this point, because if you have fire and heat like regularly around, you know, whatever, it's like 2,500 2,600 degrees, to where iron melts and steel melts, so you have like an already relatively close by number to go off of. And it's like, you know, just, you know, jumping further with Natsu, it's like burning time and burning, you know, things that don't make sense logically. But when you apply the theories of what we know with heat, like, you know, you get to like Planck temperature, and to where when you get a level of heat, it ignores the laws of physics, so you can do something like theoretically burn time. It just does stuff that normally you wouldn't be able to explain with science. but because we know that, say Wall's plasma, and where it's at Natsu's base fire is hotter than nuclear plasma, it aligns up to where you can say, okay, well, it's consistent in what we've been shown, but also as we've seen Natsu's fire and heat later, there's just a consistent level of breaking of, again, the laws of physics and burning concepts that line up with this. So when you look at one of his earliest best feats, and it's like at the very start of the series, he's able to reach 5 to even 10,000 degrees Celsius at this point. It's a really good display again of what his fire can achieve just based off of this fundamental mechanic that exists within it that I think doesn't get brought up a lot, because it's not the same thing as, say, something like something like Naruto's tailed beast stuff, or Ichigo's mask and his hollow powers, to where it is something tied directly in his powers that can be result, because it's not the same. Like Natsu has his ethereal stuff, but he's never been able to just like get into a rage spot, pop it, and it just goes off. The only times we've ever had it in those scenarios were very specific, and as far as we know, it's not going to be a direct, he's in a bad enough mood, he's angry enough, and it just goes off. Maybe that'll be something that is more of a recent occurrence and recent problem. And I guess recent is saying it's like up in the future, because you can only really say when he thought Lucy was killed by Demaria that it was like a rage moment for him that triggered it. But we also don't know the variables of what was going on with, like, obviously his book being messed with by Zareth that would have tied into this. Maybe it's different now, but as it were, we don't know 100% if it's going to trigger. Like I said, with like Ichigo and Naruto, there is a way that it's not guaranteed, but we know that it is back pocket ready if it's way more likely than, say, like where Natsu's, where it's not, they've had theirs more frequently within the verse, whereas Natsu hasn't had his. So you can look at it and say, okay, well, this is his power that's baseline tied to his emotions. And we see it, I don't think that we've seen it enough throughout the series that it really ties in, is probably the bigger problem. Is that we have it, say, in this scenario, and you can look at areas where, like, where Natsu's emotional side, obviously, like when he's emotionally just revved up and his power spikes, but it's usually displayed more so in power across the board and his skills across the board of what he can do as a Dragon Slayer, and not necessarily just as heat. And I think because of that, like a power like this is very gone under the radar. It's brushed under the rug by a lot of readers and viewers and fans. And you have to kind of look at where stuff was initially in order to really understand the scale. Because if you think about it, at the very beginning of the series, Natsu getting burning, melting metal and glass is already pretty fair, and just what you would expect a heat-based character to have. But at like the start of the series, and then you connect to see all these spots where he's gone to extremes, and then where he's at now, it just makes a lot more sense. It makes a lot more consistent sense as to how he's able to do something crazy when you see the steps that go to these points. Again, it's like when you see Natsu having fire that's hotter than Wall's nuclear plasma produced at 200 million degrees. You have these crazier numbers, but when you think about like the gap of time and level, and you think, well, early series Natsu was already, his fire was hot enough to melt metals, and when he was, and he's actually really locked in, if he's producing 5 to 10,000 degrees Celsius, and this was Natsu at relatively his weakest. We look at, say, not only strength rising across the board, increases to all stats, having, form upgrades and multipliers, getting lightning, and, you have to tie in the energy heat levels of lightning and put it to his fire, because obviously, like, stuff like his Fire Dragon King mode and any of his Dragon Force stuff is going to have way more heat and energy than his Lightning Flame Dragon mode, just based off logic. And because of that, it makes it way more of a consumable understanding as to what gets him to where he's at now. And he has these crazy levels of heat feats and displays that normally you wouldn't get in most fictions, because most of the time, you start it with a fire character, getting him to like melt steel and stone and do stuff like that is already like a really big step. But it's like Natsu was relatively there like at the start of the series. So when you get to like burning effects and powers, and then eventually burning concepts and things that don't logically make sense, it puts you in just like a crazier pathway, really, to understanding what got him to this point and where he, logically tracked in each of these steps to be at this point. But other than that, I'd love to hear what you guys have to say on this. I'm gonna talk more about just some of like the weird displays and like feats and events and how they, in more depth and detail, went around. I know this one is like way more specific. It's way more of like it's just one spot that happens. Natsu does a lot of heat. You understand all the wind stripping off Erigor and going towards Natsu. And we have Happy give us again a direct explanation to it. So it's like when you just plug in the science and it's like talking about, well, okay, well, how low pressure areas overheat, because the level of heat is important. The AoE of the heat is important because of, obviously it's this level of heat produced over this much area is going to affect the environment this much. So seeing it all and explaining, needing much higher levels in a condensed, specific, and localized zone, it's easier to have processed and make sense. And I just printed it out right here. Just read it as I go about it, and we'll talk about the events. But anyway, other than that, we'll talk to you guys in the next one. And like I said, I'd love to hear what you guys have to say on this. And what other feats or displays in the series would you like to see either gone into by me or, I can AoE it a little bit, or AoE it, AI it a little bit, just to get a much more direct explanation. But anyway, other than that, I'll talk to you guys in the next one.